Last week, we began a new sermon series entitled Small Things, Big Difference. It's not necessarily things we're going to talk about that may not be actually kind of big things that we need to change in our lives to grow, to be like Jesus. But the things that might seem insignificant when we first talk about them. We talked last time about the fact that we don't always see growth in our lives. And there might be times in our lives where we say, I'm listening to God. I'm listening to try to hear something, but just nothing is coming through. And I'm frustrated because I'm struggling with the same things that I seem to always struggle with. But God may just be doing incremental little things in our lives to help us develop. We need to find ways to reform some of the smaller things in our lives to help us to grow, to help facilitate what God is doing. We came up with a word last time. I said there was a whole bunch of little things that we could be doing. Maybe one thing is focusing on a word. And I gave us the word glory because chasing after the glory of God changes things for us. It changes our perspective. Instead of chasing after the things that annoy us or the things that distract us, chase after the things of the glory of God, His beautiful glory. On August 25th, 1896, the Sultan of a little country called Zanzibar, which is today part of the East African country of Tanzania, the Sultan of Zanzibar died. And he may have been helped along as he died because he was quickly replaced by a relative who wanted to take the country in a different direction. See, this was a point of time where Africa was being carved up into all sorts of little colonies, and the French had taken a big chunk, the English had taken a big chunk. The area around Zanzibar was predominantly controlled by the Germans, except for this little island where the English kind of held sway. Even though they had their own leader, the English were kind of in control, and the new leader wanted to switch things and affiliate more with the Germans. The English weren't very happy about that. In fact, they were downright upset. And before the end of the day that the Sultan died, they issued an ultimatum saying, okay, the new Sultan here, he's going to resign within 48 hours or else. It was kind of an open-ended thing. You can fill in the blanks. Britain's a pretty powerful country at this point in time. 48 hours ended at 9 a.m. 2 days later. The British came up with a whole bunch of local troops that were in their area. 3 naval cruisers, 2 gunboats, 150 British Marines. This new Sultan started to call on the people who lived around him and the capital city, and he got 2,800 of his followers to come and surround the palace. Some of them had machine guns, some of them didn't have weapons at all. It was kind of a little bit of a motley group. At 9 o'clock, the ultimatum ended. And at 9:02, the British shot one shot towards kind of this palace in the capital city. They knocked over the flag of the country, and that was the beginning of the war. There was a barrage of guns. The British landed their troops, and by 9:40, British troops entered the palace. Through that time, 500, I don't know if this is what you would say, but Zanzibarian? I don't know if that's a real word. There's 500 casualties, dead and wounded. 1 British sailor received a minor wound. It was pretty one-sided. By 9:40, the palace had been seized, and a new sultan put in place. Now I'm pointing this out because that war lasted from 902 to 940. History will tell us it is the shortest declared war in history. It lasted 38 minutes. That's pretty lopsided, isn't it? Now let me ask you, in our lives, God talks about, we're in a war. Do you think God can win the war that easily? How about the things that we battle in our lives? If God is for us, do you think he could just sweep in and defeat everything that goes wrong in our lives that simply? That the war in our lives could be over in 38 minutes, and 38 minutes, all of a sudden, we're perfect. Everything's right. I've got my life in order. Everything is going the way that it should. Do you think God can win that war? I'd say he probably could. But what would that end us like? We would cease to be human, wouldn't we? Kind of robots. Because God can sweep in and win the great victory, but God wants us to grow towards his heavenly glory. The cost would be that we would cease to be truly human. In Romans 12, we're going to focus on one verse of that I read a little bit earlier. And I'm going to put in a little bit of a different translation. In fact, a little bit of a different translation than I usually pick. This is the New Living Translation. I kind of like the way it phrases this. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. This is the call of the Apostle Paul. He's saying throughout the book of Romans, we need to be different than this world out here. And occasionally he reminds us, here are some behaviors that I really don't want to see you doing. But you know what? Before we really can correct our actions, sometimes we need to correct something that at least in the world might appear smaller. Because it's something that's unseen. And that is something that's just within us, and it is our thought lives. Our minds, who we really are, our actions, our will, line up with where our thought lives are. What goes on in our minds? What's in the forefront? What controls our thinking? Do we spend a lot of time thinking about the things that we fear? Do we spend a lot of time maybe not liking ourselves in our minds? Self-loathing is the way it's often called. Telling myself, I'm not good enough. I'm a failure. Or maybe telling myself that so-and-so is always disappointed with me. Or maybe I spend my time telling myself how disappointed I am with everybody else. And how everybody else is just, they don't measure up. Our actions will follow what is happening inside. So we need to bring into line the truth of how God sees me when I tell myself how I see me. The self-talk, things I'm saying to myself, need to fall in line with God's will for my life. Do I put the focus on myself or on God in the things I say to myself? There's an interesting quote from C.S. Lewis, and I put this in the bulletin this week. Some people feel guilty about their anxieties and regard them as a defect of faith. I do not agree at all. They are afflictions, not sins. And like all afflictions, they are, if we can so take them, our share in the passion of Christ. In other words, here's a remarkable thing. I want to talk about the fact that we need to get our thought lives in line with what God is telling us. And you know what? Where we struggle, this is how God helps us to grow. So even as I'm saying this, if you go home and you struggle some more, here's the good news. It's helping you come to the cross. Because ultimately we can never do anything on our own. We need to keep coming back to Jesus. And where we fail, man, here's the good news. That can bring us right back to where God wants us to be. We can have a lot of hope as we come to a tough topic. So you are. As a person thinks, so he is. That's an old saying. It comes actually out of a passage in Proverbs 23 that says this. Do not eat the food of a begrudging host. And then it goes on to explain a little bit about that. In other words, if somebody really doesn't want to give you a snack, don't make them feel guilty that they should or something like that. For he is the kind of person who's always thinking about the cost. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. You will vomit up the little you have eaten and will have wasted your compliments. Very delightful little verse, right? Sometimes the Bible can be quite graphic. The idea is, as a person thinks in his heart, so he is. It's talking about somebody whose mind and actions don't match. And there are consequences to that. You know, the Gospels talk a lot about this. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, 7, gets up in front of people and he says, you have heard it said. And then he starts saying all these things that they've been told not to do. Do not murder. Don't commit adultery. He goes through a long list. And with each one of them, then he says, but I tell you, and then he adds to it, don't even think about these things. Don't let it grow in your heart, because what is growing in our heart, our unseen character, is actually way more important than the actions that might appear on the outside. Your life will always move in the direction of your strongest thoughts. In other words, if you think you can't, you probably won't. If you think life is going to be bad, it probably will go wrong. If you think people are thinking poorly of you, you will find evidence to prove it. If you are convinced someone doesn't like you, even if they're not thinking of you in any way or they actually do like you, if you're convinced they don't like you, you will find things that convince you that they don't like you. On the other hand, if you think you can, you probably will. If you believe that there's opportunities out there for you, you will see those opportunities. If you believe that God is for you, you will sense his power and his presence, because our thoughts matter. As a person thinks, so he becomes. And your life is always moving in the direction of your most powerful thoughts. So that's why we need to understand what we're thinking. We're going to do a little test. You don't actually have to follow along with this. Just do it in your mind. Think of a scale of 1 to 10. And I want you to give yourself a 1 to 10. 10 being, this is most like you. A 1 being, this is... Actually, let me rephrase that. I'm going to give you 2 words. And they're going to be close to 1, and one's going to be close to 10. Let me give you the examples to help us understand that. I want you to think. I want you to give yourself a number in your mind. Well, let's say I give you 2 words. One is the word fearful. And one is the word peaceful. Say peaceful is a 10 and fearful is a 1. Do you have peaceful thoughts or do you have fearful, angry thoughts? Let's think about that for a minute. Where would you place? Don't say it out loud. Where would you put yourself? For the most part, when you're thinking and you're talking to yourself and you're hearing your own thoughts, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being you're very much a discontented person. You're always looking for more. And 10 is you're just perfectly content with life. You're happy where things are at. Where would you go? Scale of 1 to 10. What do you think about most? 1 being the present day struggles and 10 being future glory. Well, God is God for you. On those scales of 1 to 10, do you know what? If you didn't give yourself a 10 on all 3 categories, this message is for you. Why does this matter? Because our thoughts determine who we become. As a person thinks in his heart, so he becomes. And if you're consumed with worldly thoughts and worried thoughts and negative thoughts, you're going to move in that direction. If on the other hand you're consumed with peace and positive thoughts and eternal thoughts, you're going to move in that direction. Romans 12:2. I put it up here earlier. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Think about this. We live in a very negative world. We live in a world that understands very much fear. Shouldn't those who follow Jesus be different? So don't follow the custom of this world. Instead, let God transform the very thoughts within your life. He says, don't copy what you see in the world, but let Him change the way you think. Let God transform you into a new person, and you will become like your greatest thoughts. And your life can move in the direction that is different than this world. And how do we do that? Sometimes it's by doing some pretty small things. Talk about a demolition day out of 2 Corinthians, where it says this: For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. Paul is talking to this church in the city of Corinth, which unfortunately they were believing a lot of lies. He says, we live in this world. And the world is waging a war against us. You're a Christian. But there's some really good news. The weapons of this fight are not the weapons of this world. We have supernatural weapons available to us, and they are powerful. Our weapons can destroy the strongholds. He goes on, he says this: take every thought captive. That word captive is interesting. The way I think of it, the way we can think about this, it's almost like a castle. A medieval castle. Can you picture a really magnificent castle? Maybe you've been to one in Europe or something like that. Maybe you can just picture the grandiose thing. They're quite magnificent. We've had a few opportunities in our lives to travel and to be able to see some pretty magnificent palaces over the years. And they're great places to be. They're magnificent. Do you know what's often in the basement? That's not so much the magnificent place, particularly the medieval ones. You know what's down there? That's a dungeon. It's where they throw people who may be misbehaving or something like that, or opposed to the king, or something like that. And it was not a pleasant place. It was dark, it was damp, and it was not nice. And that's the word that's being used here when it talks about captive. It is a Greek word that sometimes we translate here, we could translate a bunch of different ways, but dungeon might work just as well as anything. And many times we might be thinking ourselves living in this great castle of God's mighty kingdom, and yet because of our thought lives and because of what we dwell on in our minds, we're locked down in the dungeon of a beautiful palace. We put ourselves down there. What should we be putting down there? Well, according to this verse, what should be going down there are the things that are the lies of the devil. They should be locked up, not us. We've been given this magnificent palace of the glory of God. And sometimes we get so negative on ourselves, we put ourselves down in the dungeon, when instead we're called to be up with the King. But those negative fears, those arguments of the devil, that is what should be locked down there. Satan, do you know what he's called? He's called the father of lies. The father of lies. And so he tries to convince us of things that are not true. And in our thought process, we can build a life on those lies rather than the truth. Verse that I just read out of 2 Corinthians. They're our hope. They are our hope. We demolish arguments and every pretense that sets itself against the knowledge of God, is how one translation puts it. We destroy those things. We take captive our thought lives to make it obedient to God. So when we hear things that are the lies of the devil, we take them prisoner. We take them captive. I can't make a difference. I'm no good. I'm a screw up. I'm never going to amount to anything. We just say to that, no. No, no, no. We take those thoughts captive and we make them obedient to Jesus. Last little bit about there is about punishing every disobedience when your obedience is complete. We punish those thoughts. We get rid of them. We say that they are not true. We do not let them control us. God is going to take those thoughts and turn them around completely. Make a big difference in our lives. Bring us to the glory of God. Take us from saying that I'm a failure to being able to say, but God still loves me. That everything's different. And when we come to these things, we discover that God is making us like Jesus. And we go from things like, I can never overcome this. I've been addicted for so long. I've tried, I prayed, I can never. We say that those things are garbage. And the truth is that Jesus is working in strength. And so we take the thoughts that are untrue captive. We capture them and we make them obedient to Jesus. And we capture destructive thoughts and we get rid of them. And then we turn our thinking completely around to another direction. Philippians chapter 4 says this, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. You've learned and received and heard and seen me practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. In other words, here's where our thoughts should be. We should focus our minds on the things of God. Not on myself, not on things that are destructive, but on Jesus. I come back to this a lot. You know, the things that we input into our lives play such a big role. And we spend our lives listening to gossip. Or maybe we spend all our time on social media these days. Or maybe even listening to the regular media. They build us closer to Jesus. I'm not saying we never go near those things. It's impossible. But what is the main input into our lives? What do we input? Are there positive inputs instead? Where we see things that might help us see what God is doing. Maybe somebody gets mad at us. You ever heard somebody get mad at you? Unjustly, unfairly? I have. We've all been there. Right? Maybe the positive input is rather than listening to them, asking God, so why are they feeling this way? And taking time to pray for them. How can I pray for that person? How can I help make a difference in their lives? When we see somebody who is in need, sometimes we think, oh man, I don't have time to listen to their problems. And he says, saying, God, thank you for putting this person in my life that I could play with. And when God uses us, then coming back to Him and praying to Him. And suddenly, you know what? You discover you have power in Jesus because we're learning to focus on the things of Jesus. And saying to the lies, that's garbage. That's trash. Get rid of it. And saying instead, do you know what? I'm gonna listen to things. I'm gonna look at things that input positive in my life. I'm gonna be looking at the scriptures. Maybe spending more time in the Bible than I presently do. Maybe I just need to spend more time listening to worship music. And I've come back to this a few times over the last couple of months. Maybe our music choices play a role in bringing positive into our lives. We just need to find ways to put positive inputs into our heart. Because as a person thinks, so he is. And as we put these things and we're dwelling on them, are we dwelling on the things that are good? Or things that are struggle? I know sometimes my thought life can go into such a direction that I can be very negative in my thoughts. That all of a sudden some fears or struggles start to come to the forefront. And they're the things I dwell in, and I wake up at night and I can't fall back asleep because I'm thinking on these negative things. That's not what God wants for us. What God wants for us is victory. So we take captive those things and we say no. And we fix our thoughts on the things that are excellent, the things that are praiseworthy, the things that are worth spending our thoughts on. Imagine we all just spent a few more minutes in prayer. 5 more minutes maybe reading the Bible. Or listen to maybe 1 or 2 more worship songs a day. What difference would that make? Those are small things, aren't they? But are they small things that might transform our thinking and help put positive inputs into our lives that might make a difference? To put inputs that allow God to transform our self-talk. That's who we are as people. And we need to work at letting God transform what's inside. So we're going to take a moment, we're going to sing a closing hymn together, and it's one, we're going to sing one that I haven't chosen in a long time. It's hymn number 504 if you want to follow along with the books. Notice if you follow along with the books, so this does the chorus slightly different, so you may want to just follow along with the screen. But it's I Will Sing the Wondrous Story.